heat being stored in that deep ocean current and being within that current and coming back up to the surface and being input to the surface waters, and that could take up to 10,000 years to occur.
What does this mean to us? Explain that.
What it means is that we've talked about that the weather is cycles. Climates are cycles. Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the little known, but I think one of the most interesting conferences occurred in 1990 in Warsaw, Poland, where the Soviets, as they were then, were presenting one view of weather and climate, and the Western world, mostly represented by the U.S., were presenting a completely different view. It was seen by outsiders and the media and so on, and totally misunderstood as, oh, this is a political East-West Cold War conflict. It was nothing of the sort. What went on at that conference was it split into the two groups. One was the Eastern Europeans and the Soviets saying that the weather and the climate it goes in cycles. And the Russians, they've been studying cycles. For example, one of the well-known ones in economics is the K cycle, the Kondratiev cycle. They just argue, and I tend to agree with them, that there are just a multitude of cycles that are all interacting with each other and create the net effect, which is the weather. And of course, sorting out the different cycles and how they interact is a hugely complex problem. At that conference, the other view, presented primarily by the U.S., as I said, was that, no, it's chaotic. You can't predict it. It's completely chaotic, and it doesn't work in any predictable patterns or cycles at all. And that's when, of course, the chaos theory was dominating everything in Western science. And by the way, the Chinese were also accepting the Soviet point of view, and I did some work with Chinese climatologists on the ability to increase their food production in northern China and what the weather conditions and climate conditions were like. But they had they had the Soviet view that it was cycles because, of course, they had records of 3,000 years in length that showed them these patterns. And so that 1990 conference, which, as I said, was interpreted as a political split, was in fact a huge academic split. And one of the people that became a victim of this was a fellow by the name of Milutin Milankovic. Now, Milankovic was a Yugoslavian, Serbian, a mathematician, and this is an interesting part of what we're talking about here, this wider global view of things. He was connected with a fellow by the name of Köppen, Vladimir Köppen, Koeppen, who was the first person to come up with a climate classification. That is to identify the different climate classes around the world. In other words, he was looking at a global pattern. He was also working with, and they communicated with each other, and I can't remember exactly, but I believe Köppen, there was a marriage between them, there was a marriage relationship in there, but they were also working with Wegener. Okay, Wegener was the guy that came up with the continental drift theory. That is that the continents were moving and the Earth's crust was plates. And, of course, this was ridiculed and rejected, and now, of course, we know that Alfred Wegener's continental drift theory is at the very basics of geological understanding of the world.
And yet, at that time, he was ridiculed terribly.
Yeah, 1912 was when he came out with that theory. Okay, now Sir Francis Bacon, who was an Elizabethan scientist, he'd noticed that the western part of Europe and Africa fit with the eastern part of North America and South America, but that was just simply a sort of a pattern recognition observation. But these three men were working together. What they were doing was looking at the world on a global basis and looking at the patterns of it. And all three of them had their ideas initially sort of looked at, no, that's interesting, and then totally rejected because they conflicted with the prevailing wisdom of things, and they conflicted with people's view. They said, well, Wegener, for example, oh, how could continents move? That's simply illogical. And
don't you think academia can be very mean? Academia culture can be extremely mean-spirited about information and knowledge.
Oh, the politics of universities, and I've worked in government, I've worked in private industry, I've worked on my own, and I've been an academic. The politics in university are the worst, the most vicious, and I think it was, I believe it was Enoch Powell said, because they've got nothing better to do with their time than to attack each other. And but it's the most vicious, and there's been several books written about that, about the academic. And of course, as I've always said about universities, and what Prince Philip, who doesn't say very many bright things, but one thing he said was that universities are the only truly incestuous system in our society, that everybody that is in them is a product of them. And of course, the other thing is that your promotion and advancement in the universities is determined by your colleagues. And of course, so what you've got is the prisoners running the prison. It's the most remarkable situation.
Go back to Milankovitch for us.
Yeah, well, Milankovitch, as I said, he was working with Wegener and Köppen, and Köppen's least known of the three, obviously. But Milankovitch came out with his theory in the 1950s, and it was published, and it was generally accepted initially. That people said, well, yeah, this is a very interesting idea. Now, it wasn't new. And what Milankovitch's idea was that there were three things that controlled the long-term temperature of the Earth. One was the change in orbit of the Earth around the Sun. And the second was the change of the tilt of the Earth. And the third was what's called the precession of the equinox. This is a change of the date of equinoxes and solstices over a period of time because of the other two changes. Now, we're still teaching in most schools that the orbit of the Earth around the Sun is a fixed elliptical orbit. But we've known for 150 years that that's not true. A Scottish fellow by the name of Cole was studying how changes in the orbit of the Earth, which is caused, by the way, by the gravitational pull of the planet Jupiter, will change the temperature of the Earth because of the orbital changes. And so Milankovitch took that, and he took the tilt change and the precession, and he showed, and by the way, the calculations he did pre-computer was absolutely incredible, because he calculated the amount of energy received from the sun with each of these changes for every 5 degrees of latitude for a period of 400,000 years. It took him 30 years of his life to do these calculations, and his ideas, as I said, it's an incredible piece of work that he did. His ideas were accepted, but then, and I remember this happening, all of a sudden Milankovitch was rejected, completely thrown out. His son later wrote a wonderful article saying his father died of a broken heart because his ideas were rejected. Well, what caused the rejection of his ideas was the introduction of a new technology called radiocarbon dating. And so here was a new technology. Oh, radio, it's carbon. It's, this is very sophisticated and so on. Well, how did this reject Milankovitch? Well, Milankovitch had shown that there was ice in Alaska at a certain time period. And then somebody had got some material and measured the radiocarbon date of it and showed, oh, no, there was a forest in that area at that time. There couldn't have been a glacier there. So because the radiocarbon date showed that there couldn't have been ice when Milankovitch said there was ice, they threw the whole idea out. It turned out later that it was the radiocarbon dating that was wrong. Now, why was it wrong? Because they assumed that the amount of carbon-12 coming out from the sun was constant. And it is anything but constant. It varies all of the time. But of course, we were into that thing that you and I have talked about uniformitarianism. So Milankovitch died